For anyone identifying as a Jew, the events of October 7 changed the whole world. I've not met any Jewish person who was not shocked to the core and surprised by what occurred. This happened in two phases. First, there was the sheer brazen brutality of the events and the growing realization of the vulnerability and lack of protection that was revealed. Helpless Jewish people were subjected to horrors not even imagined in the post-Holocaust world. Much has been written about this and said, and I do not have much to add. I do not even have the words. However, if there are questions about this and about the Israeli-Palestine conflict more broadly, I am willing and happy to answer questions if you communicate with me about that. Give you my opinion for what it's worth. The second phase is what is relevant to what I have to say in this presentation. It concerns how events unfolded in the hours, days, months, and now almost a year since October 7. And I now realize it concerns also events that developed in the lead up to it. In fact, it concerns much of what I have been worrying about in connection with what I will call the health and survival of Western civilization itself. So what do I mean by Western civilization, and how does this connect to October 7 and the aftermath of those events? It is too easily forgotten that we live in a time of human history that is unique. What I am calling Western civilization is only about 300 years old, and it is younger than that in some places and barely evident in other places. Surprisingly, few people spare a thought for just how unique our lives are, and even less the reasons for it. The philosophers of the Scottish Enlightenment of the mid-18th century, Adam Smith being the best known among them, observed the unprecedented mass prosperity then just beginning to take off in England, and attributed it to the extensive and complex division of labor that arises automatically when people are free to trade, when, as Smith put it, that simple and obvious system of natural liberty exists. Voluntary trade creates value, and this unleashes the creative desires and abilities of production and innovation. What needs to be emphasized is the philosophical, ethical basis upon which this explosion of prosperity depended and still depends. In a nutshell, it is the acceptance of universal, equal, individual human rights, a completely revolutionary idea at its time. The idea that everyone, without exception, peasant or king, possesses the same freedoms. This obviously means that everyone possesses the same constraints to their freedom as well. Freedom implies the freedom to act in any way as long as it does not constrain the freedom of others to do this as well. Spelling this out in more detail takes us back 100 years to John Locke's conception of natural property rights. Every individual owns himself and those things he has appropriated from nature or received in voluntary trade. In fact, everything comes down to secure property rights, which includes rights to one's own person, rights to trade, and to contract to trade one's labor and one's property in the pursuit of one's happiness. So quite simply, what I am calling Western civilization, that system of unprecedented peace and abundance, rests fundamentally on the principle of universal individual freedom. I shall use the term capitalism and Western civilization interchangeably. Now, of course, a perfect classical liberal system, just as I've just described, has never existed anywhere in a pure, perfect form, without imperfections or compromises. The world is an imperfect place because people are imperfect. We have corruption, violence, war, and all manner of challenges to Adam Smith's system of natural liberty. There are millions of people in the world, domestic and abroad, who simply do not believe in these classical liberal values and would like to destroy Western civilization and replace it with some alternative social system. This has always been true, and there has always been the problem of how to enforce property rights and deal with what we call bad actors, people with bad intentions. But as Adam Smith suggested, there is a lot of ruin in a nation, meaning that as long as the tacit and conscious support for the essential fundamentals of Western civilization was strong enough, as long as that support was strong enough, the system could withstand these imperfections, as it has done in many places. The result being spectacular explosion of wealth and creativity that now exists in this expanding global capitalist way beyond the geographical West itself. Capitalism, Western civilization, has always had its detractors. There are, for example, the market reformers, what I call the market reformers. Some of them just don't like the diversity of individual economic outcomes that they call inequality. They favor government intervention financed by government violation of individual property rights by confiscating individual earnings. This puts a strain on the creative powers of the free market, of the market system. The damage inflicted by this depends on the extent of this redistributive intervention. This kind of social engineering and other interventions in the form of industrial policy, favoring some industries over others, has been growing in America and has the potential to destroy the market economy completely and the civilization upon which it rests. Great Britain has gone to the brink with these types of policies, drawn back, and now seems to be trying it again. The various strands of market socialism and the social democrats in Europe fall into this category. It is the most resilient and common category of challenges to the capitalist market system. To this extent, the political economy of capitalism suggests that capitalism actually, in a way, always contains the seeds of its own destruction, and only luck and eternal vigilance can prevent this destruction. Argentina is a painful example of abject failure in this regard, where these policies led to a complete collapse of the system of capitalism and abundance. The market reformers in America have hijacked the word liberal. It now commonly refers to those who favor government policies aimed at improving the lot of the less well-off, and insofar as it supports activist government intervention, it has come to mean the opposite of classical liberal. This has added greatly to the confused state of our public discourse. So from now on, I will distinguish between classical liberalism and American liberalism, or just liberalism, to avoid confusion. American liberalism is not the real thing, but it is the way the word is most popularly used these days. In this slide, I have an outline of my the claims that I'm going to make today, featuring what I call the revolutionary transformers. At the top, you get the American liberals, who are the market reformers I've just described, and they are not transformers. They do not want to transform the entire capitalist system, but only to reform it. It's the revolutionary transformers that I believe are the real threat. And as I shall outline, they are composed of two component groups. The first being what I call the critical radicals, who we shall see are composed of pseudo-Marxist zero-sum worldview people, as I will explain, and the fundamentalist radicals that I'll deal with at the end. Now, the revolutionary transformers are a recent phenomenon in the sense of being only about 2 decades old, but their roots go much deeper than that. They are much more radical and obscure than people realize. It is a threat to the most essential fundamentals of Western civilization. I will call it the incongruous alliance. The incongruous alliance is an alliance between what I will call, as in the previous slide, critical radicalism and fundamentalist radicalism. And I obviously need to explain what I mean by this. The critical radicals, by them I refer to a set of ideas, actually ideologies and systems of ideas, that derive ultimately, though most people don't know this, that derive ultimately from Karl Marx. As my colleague Phil Magnus and Michael Markovi, my colleagues, have shown, Marx was an obscure, idiosyncratic socialist writer prior to his transformation owing to the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 and the subsequent work of his disciples and extenders in Europe, mainly Germany and France. And for many reasons beyond our current concern, Marx's work seems to have an appealing mystique that draws adherents, intellectuals, regardless of any relationship to any real-world experience, to any reality. The German critical theory tradition comes out of the Frankfurt School of Max Horkheimer, Theodore Adorno, and Herbert Marcuse. And the French deconstructionist post-colonial Marxist tradition is associated with Derrida, Althusser, Sartre, Fanon, and, at least during his Marxist phase, Foucault. This is from Phil Magnus, and any errors I may have made on my own. Simplifying this stream of European social philosophy is pseudo-Marxist in nature. Simplifying it, it is pseudo-Marxist in nature. And it has very successfully migrated and morphed to the United States and elsewhere, germinating most faithfully in the universities. The predominance of adherence to these pseudo-Marxist doctrines, especially but not only in the humanities and social sciences, is absolutely astounding. Perhaps the most appealing explanatory element can be found in what F.A. Hayek called the conflict between instinct and reason that resides in all human beings. Humans are hardwired to care about and protect their family members to the point of great sacrifice. In the evolution of society from small family or kin groups to massive extended orders of millions of people, they feel uneasy about their inability to care for the massive extended family of humanity, of humans, and search for analog mechanisms to take care of them like they took care of their family. Like forcing more fortunate and wealthy people to share their lot with the least fortunate. They find the idea counterintuitive and unpalatable, unpleasant, that one should not look to good intentions for good results. That in fact people in general do best when all are encouraged to satisfy their own self-interest. They do more good that way than when they try to do good. But these people are not persuaded by Adam Smith's observation that it is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, and the baker that we get our dinner, but from their attention to their own self-interest. By contrast, a Marxist zero-sum world in which outcomes are the result of individual conflicts between classes of people is an appealing one. A Marxist system is deterministic, tracing out dynamic conflicts between the classes of society that are defined by their ownership of the means of production. Most particularly, the working class is exploited by the capitalist class to the point that they are driven to revolution. The laws of history lead inexorably to the final phase of a classless society where all exploitative elements have been removed. The very nature of humanity is changed by an unimaginably radical transformation, according to Marx. Later, pseudo-Marxist developments, like the critical theory in Germany and the French post-colonial philosophy, have tweaked Marxist categories to identify different groups of exploiters and exploited, of oppressors and victims. And it is this dichotomy that has most recently taken hold in the minds of the academics, their students, and radical elements of the street. Most obviously, critical race theory has replaced class with race, or perhaps more accurately, made race determinative of class. And there are irresistible extensions to other group identifiers like gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, disability, and so on. And thus we get intersectionality of victims. Group identity is everything. You are either an oppressor or a victim, solely by virtue of your group identity. The notion of universal, equal human rights is anathema to these people, to these critical radicals. And they are quite prepared to adopt violent means for the achievement of noble ends. They are social justice warriors who want to replace the false values of the oppressive capitalist system with something else. It's seldom clear what. They want retribution for all the grievances they can imagine. This is the stuff of the surging woke revolution that has infiltrated our institutions of learning from kindergarten to college, and our institutions of government from city council to Congress. And of course, it is dominant in social media as well. A relevant question is, how far will it go? Will there be a pushback, and will it be sufficient? I first became aware of this woke mindset, though not of its obscure European origins, with the election of Barack Obama. I think his contribution to this threat and the confusion underlying it has been grossly underestimated. It may be worthwhile explaining why I say this. Very early on, I found myself repelled by the content of Obama's speeches, and during his presidency, I could not listen to him talk. He annoyed and frightened me. I was surprised to find out how many people, how many of my friends, by contrast, simply ate it up. I wondered how many actually thought about what he was saying rather than simply reacting to his charisma and the fact that he was black. They liked the idea, the showcasing of a black American president. What irked and disturbed me was that every time he opened his mouth, he insinuated the existence of some sort of festering grievance to be concerned about. Basically, what Barack Obama did was to break with the long sweep of respectable black American liberalism from Frederick Douglass to Martin Luther King to current black intellectuals like Thomas Sowell, John Riley, John McWhorter, and many, many others. Frederick Douglass, an ex-slave, was crystal clear. He rejected slavery and lingering racism. He rejected them as un-American, as a betrayal of basic and universal classical liberal American values. For Douglass, American liberalism was aspirational and inspirational. He looked to the words of the Declaration of Independence and took them seriously. The self-evident truth that all people are equally endowed with the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. America had fallen down, but the values themselves were unassailable. These included freedom to trade, to own property, to express one's views, to assemble. He was explicit in rejecting special treatment for ex-slaves. He rejected paternalism as insulting. Similarly, Martin Luther King was clear in his condemnation not of American liberal values, but of the failure to implement them as they should have been implemented to create an America in which his children would be judged by the content of their character and the color of their skin would be irrelevant. Both were, in this sense, proud Americans. And there are today many other proud classical liberal black Americans who feel the same way, who embrace the progress against racism that has been made and seek an ever better America. Obama's story is different, has always been different. He explicitly downplayed American exceptionalism and encouraged the view that the American experience was one that was dominated by the white race to the unambiguous detriment of non-whites. So-called American values are the values of colonial domination. It is time for blacks to rediscover their own authentic black experience, which involves the rejection of much of so-called classical liberalism. High on the list is the challenge against free speech, because the establishment powers control the channels of public expression for their own purposes. The damages of white domination need to be addressed firmly using the mighty power of the federal government with access to an unlimited amount of tax money restored from the property of the unjustifiably rich. Social justice must be done, and this will involve, sooner or later, a complete transformation of the current economic and social system. Obama was at the forefront, if not the leader, of a separate black identity, separate from and antithetical to the American identity. Obama's presidency left many Americans very uneasy, feeling an undercurrent of something very un-American, very hostile and threatening. In this very real sense, Obama caused Trump. And this black identity is really more than that. It is really an anti-white identity, where white is more a state of being than a skin color. Thus, the anomaly of the Jews and the Asians, Obama was never overtly anti-Semitic, but his view of the Jews as a group is, as distinct from his Jewish friends, is undoubtedly hostile. The Jews cannot claim to be non-white, no matter what their experience as victims or their skin color, even if they come from North Africa. This black identity worldview that he supported and promoted has developed a new strain of virulent anti-Semitism alongside its anti-white racism. The flowering of woke ideology, with its intolerance of any dissident views and rejection of any limits to the scope of social justice funded by the government, by government activity, and the explosion of the DEI culture starts with Barack Obama. In more mundane terms, Obama is the starting point of the ramping up of state capitalism. Remember what he said, you didn't build that. The ramping up of state capitalism, buoyed by the emergency of the Great Recession and the permission it gave him to blow out the federal budget to unprecedented levels and pile on regulations in all aspects of life, especially business life. A ball picked up very eagerly by Biden, who has run even further with it. Obama honed the practice of disregarding and bending congressional limits to the implementation of unlegislated policies, something his successors have eagerly emulated. And even now, while still ensconced in Washington, D.C., he is apparently pulling strings, influencing policy directions. Like all politicians, Barack Obama should not be trusted. But more than most, like Trump, he should be feared. So much for the critical radicals. It needs to be emphasized that the market reformers, the plain vanilla American liberals, see the critical radicals as simply an extreme form of themselves, the extreme left of the Democratic Party. They are the progressives. They are hot-blooded versions of themselves who are to be admired for their passion and managed into moderation for the greater good. So they tolerate them, even encourage them. The critical radicalism is attractive to elites, especially the young and the brave of them, eager to flaunt their liberal credentials, and to Hollywood airheads for the same reason. The net result is that the biggest component of liberal America is ignorant of the essentially radical, destructive, and racist nature of the woke critical radical revolution. And for some, October 7th provided a rude wake-up call. Back to my slide outline of group identifications of ideas. I now turn to the fundamentalist radicals. Who are they? Well, basically the fundamentalist radicals are the jihadis. This branch of the Islamic world is long-lived, goes back centuries, and wide-ranging, is active all over the world and has been for many years, many centuries. Its core objective is world domination. It is motivated by the zealous conviction that the world has been corrupted by the West, by Christianity, by colonialism, by materialistic, atheistic capitalism. The long-run objective is to defeat and remove all manifestations of the infidels' culture everywhere. But they know that this overall aim will take a very long time. It will require slow, patient infiltration and insidious degradation of the fabric of the hostile cultures wherever they are. But in the meantime, there is a much more urgent and achievable immediate objective along the way, and that is to remove the state of Israel. Israel is an unacceptable, foreign, non-Muslim authority in the middle of the land of Islam. Non-Muslims can live peacefully as subservient people in Muslim-ruled states, but never as rulers or people with equal rights, according to this doctrine. The Islamist opposition to a Jewish-ruled state in Israel and in what used to be Palestine dates back to at least the end of the 19th century and has become a very resilient part of the politics of the Arab world. The recent shift by some of the Arab states, like the UAE and Saudi Arabia, to an essentially Western orientation, embracing markets, trade, peace, and profit, has been seen with alarm as the real threat to both the short-term and long-term goals of the Islamists. Perhaps most alarming to them was the immediate alliance, the imminent alliance between Saudi Arabia and Israel. Be this as it may, my more narrow concern is that the fundamentalist radical Islamists have succeeded in convincing the woke critical radicals that they are allies. The Islamists pose as victims of capitalism and colonialism oppressed by the Western imperialists, and especially by the Jews, who are the leading oppressive component of this by their colonialization of the land of Palestine, by their colonization of the land of Palestine, from which they cleansed and continue to oppress the local people. The fact that this is an ugly, fanciful fiction matters not. The woke folk eagerly swallow the carefully crafted and generously funded Islamist propaganda. They are the useful idiots on our campuses and in many other places. The useful idiots ignore or do not know that many of them would be summarily executed for their beliefs and sexual orientations if they so much as showed their faces in Gaza. This brew has been cooking for decades, and the heat was turned up with the advent of Obama, as I explained. The superficial story is that it is about criticizing the policy of the Israeli government, and then subtly expanding this to all Zionists. And now, after October 7, Zionist is simply a code word for Jew, as was graphically illustrated very recently on my own campus at UTD. How much the useful idiots have actually brought into the deeper ancient form of Jew hatred is hard to know, but it hardly matters, given their eagerness to mount dangerous, vigorous, anti-Jewish initiatives against any and all Jewish organizations. So, in summary, the threats to capitalism that I feel heightened alarm about is this incongruous alliance of radicals with the fundamentalists using the critical radicals and the traditional American liberals looking on with paternalistic forbearance, hardly perceiving the rottenness of the core that they are tolerating. The American liberals as a whole have been blind to the incongruity of their support for violent radical movements and critical of imagined oppressors. But this has been no more striking than in the American Jewish community. The American Jewish community of about 6.8 million people, 2% of the total population, is the largest in the world outside of Israel. Israel has 7.2 million Jews. And the Jewish population of Canada is about 400,000. Though scattered across the United States and Canada, the biggest concentration by far is in the New York area, followed by the Los Angeles area. These two communities strongly influence Jewish communal affairs in America, including the role and perception of Jews in politics. Jews have been very prominent in American life, at least from the middle of the 19th century, in business, in the professions, in education, and in politics. Overwhelmingly, they have affiliated with the American liberal side of the political spectrum. They were prominent in the civil rights movement and in all liberal protest movements. So to say that the emergence of virulent anti-Semitism from within the liberals, from within the liberal coalition, as they understand it, to say that it was a surprise and a shock is an understatement. American Jews overwhelmingly still think that anti-Semitism is a right-wing phenomenon. They are used to the right-wing anti-Jewish conspiracy theories still emanating from the usual sources, and now some new ones like Kanye West and Candace Owens, who recently emerged out of some closet as completely deranged, not to mention the more subtle poison of Tucker Carlson and the people that he interviews. The idea that actually the most alarming and obvious Jew hatred emanates today from the left-wing critics, from the left-wing critical radicals and their jihad fundamentalist handlers, escapes them. Prior to October 7, the vast majority of Jews, with notable exceptions, were simply in denial about this. It was not on their radar, or they simply dismissed it as insignificant. So the question now is, given October 7 and the outrageous reaction to it, will there be a mass wake-up call? Will there be a mass waking up within the Jewish community? And will this spill over into the broader community of the liberals as a whole in America? Will it constitute the necessary pushback to arrest the gains of this radical transformation in academics, in business, in politics, and more generally? Let me talk about the reaction to October 7, the phase 2 that I mentioned at the start of this presentation. Any classical liberal, any American liberal or conservative who values America could have been expected to have been shocked beyond words by the events of October 7. By rights, the day after October 7 should have brought an avalanche of expressions of anger and revulsion, much like that President Biden, to his credit, made. But what was so eerily disturbing was the lack of this. Certainly there were some who made the expected statements and produced the expected reactions, but it was the disturbing fact that there were so few of them. Even some of those who did react negatively tempered their remarks with very disturbing qualifications about contextualizing what had happened, as though it could somehow excuse or mitigate the horrible actions that had taken place. But the real shocker was the complete absence of any comment or condemnation from so many people and so many organizations. This was graphically described by Sheryl Sandberg in her interview with Dan Sanchez in his podcast, Call Me Back. The podcast was entitled Scream Before Silence. Sheryl Sandberg, a billionaire, one-time COO of Facebook, has recently devoted herself to the plight of abused women and the question of how women in general can succeed in business and in life. Among other things, the events of October 7 were an extreme example of violence to women. Beyond extreme, Sandberg, who is Jewish, was stunned by the news and waited in vain for her liberal professional allies and friends to burst forth in vocal condemnation and calls to action of support for the surviving victims and the hostages and their families. The silence was deafening. She could not believe it. She described it as a wake-up call. Apparently, raped and murdered Jewish girls and women did not qualify as victims. It took months for some of her kindred women's organizations to begrudgingly make a perfunctory statement, and many have yet to do so. At the same time, she and others became aware of the bias in social media, how their reports detailing and condemning Israel's retaliation efforts simply omitted any mention of the hostages or even of October 7. As time has gone by, it has become evident that October 7 was actually a day of celebration for many in the critical radical camp. In some ways, it was a starting gun for the ramping up of the jihadi-fueled critical radical agenda. Students for Justice in Palestine, SJP, appeared in protests, intrusive protests and encampments on hundreds of campuses across the United States and Canada. In many cases, cheered on by liberal faculty. They made common cause with the victims of Gaza, but never once mentioned October 7 or the hostages, even though it was obvious that the release of the hostages and the delivery of the terrorist criminal leaders would have put an end to the Gaza war. At the same time, Jewish students were and are being harassed, randomly taunted all across the campuses of America. So Sheryl Sandberg reports that she was wrong about anti-Semitism, its origin and its nature. In another interview with Barry Weiss, she reports experiencing a wake-up call, again, about many things. Weiss asked her, like what exactly? And she replied, well, I realized that our K through 12 education, public education, has been wrong. After all, there are some good things that characterize America and its history. To which Weiss incredulously replied, some good things? Sandberg went on to say that she was still committed to try to repair the faults of capitalism. So this captures the problem. Sandberg is representative of an influential liberal. She has been shocked to realize that there are lots of Jew haters whom she had thought were her friends. She thought were her fellow liberals. She vaguely realizes that this is because they are not really liberals in the classical sense, and that they are racists who divide the world into successful oppressors and exploited victims, and that those who are successful, like the Jews, Asians, and whites, cannot be victims. And also, that for many, it is easy to slip from this into the age-old Jew hatred that led up to the Spanish Inquisition and the Holocaust. But she stops short of recognizing the need to re-examine her basic premise about the economic system that has made her rich. It has often been said that the Jews are the litmus test for freedom. When they flourish, freedom flourishes, and vice versa. For how many people, Jewish and non-Jewish, has the reaction to October 7 been a wake-up call? For some at least, it has. It has been a call to arms, a joining of hands by Jews, Christians, and non-affiliated to draw together and to draw attention to what has happened in America and elsewhere in the free world, and to push back by affirming the values and policies that can save Western civilization. The real question is, will it be enough? Will it be enough?